Hello everyone, and welcome back to the channel. Today, we are diving into the fascinating history behind the complex relationship between the United States and China. To truly understand why these two nations often see each other as rivals today, we need to go back to the very beginning when America was still a young republic, fresh from its independence. In the late 18th century, the United States was eager to prove itself on the global stage. It was not just about building a government at home, but also about showing the world that this new nation could stand shoulder to shoulder with the great powers of the time. One of the most promising ways to achieve that recognition was through trade. And at the heart of global commerce during this period stood China, a land that fascinated Western nations with its wealth, culture, and luxurious goods. To Americans, China represented more than just business opportunities. It was a symbol of prosperity and refinement. Chinese silk, porcelain, and especially tea were not only valuable commodities but also cultural treasures that shaped lifestyles in Europe and the Americas. By connecting with China, the United States hoped to do more than fill its ports with exotic goods. It wanted to announce its presence as a serious participant in international affairs, no longer dependent on Britain. This desire culminated in the historic voyage of the Empress of China in 1784, the first American ship to sail directly to Chinese shores. That journey was more than a trade mission, it was a declaration that the United States was ready to enter the world economy as an independent power. From this starting point, the long, complicated story of U.S.-China relations began to unfold. The story of the Empress of China in 1784 is one of those moments that perfectly captures the spirit of a young and ambitious America. Just 1 year after the Treaty of Paris officially ended the American Revolution, this ship set sail from New York Harbor. The timing was symbolic. It departed on George Washington's birthday, carrying not only goods but also the hopes of a new nation eager to step into the global arena. The cargo itself was unusual. Among the items loaded onto the ship was American ginseng, a root that Chinese elites valued for its supposed healing and energizing properties. To the people of China, ginseng was almost like a miracle product, and this made it the perfect choice for a first exchange. The Empress of China was not just bringing trade goods. It was bringing a piece of America's natural resources to one of the world's oldest civilizations. When the ship arrived in Canton, it made history. For the first time, the stars and stripes flew proudly in Chinese waters. This voyage was more than just a commercial success. It broke Britain's monopoly over the China trade, proving that the United States could act independently on the world stage. The profits were significant, and soon Chinese tea, silk, and porcelain began pouring into American homes, particularly among the wealthy elite. But beyond the numbers, there was something deeper happening. The voyage forged a cultural connection across the Pacific. Drinking Chinese tea in fine porcelain cups became a sign of sophistication in America. Owning Chinese silk symbolized status and taste. For Americans, trade with China was not only about money. It was about identity. It showed that the United States was no longer an isolated newcomer but a participant in global culture and commerce. While the voyage of the Empress of China opened exciting opportunities, it also revealed a challenge that would shape U.S.-China relations for generations: the problem of imbalance. From the very beginning, Americans loved Chinese goods far more than the Chinese wanted what America had to offer. Silk, porcelain, and especially tea quickly became essentials for wealthy families across the United States. To serve tea in delicate Chinese cups or decorate homes with fine porcelain was a mark of refinement. These items were not just products, they carried cultural prestige. America's upper class eagerly embraced them, and this growing demand meant more and more ships were heading toward China. But there was a problem. What could America give in return? Ginseng and furs were useful exports at first, but they could never match the volume or the value of what China supplied. The Chinese Empire, confident in its self-sufficiency, did not see a need for large amounts of American goods. As a result, silver began flowing out of the United States to pay for the imports. This created a trade deficit that worried American merchants and leaders alike. The imbalance was not just an economic issue. It was symbolic. It reminded Americans that, while they were eager to build equal partnerships abroad, in reality, they still depended heavily on the desires and conditions set by others. China, at the time, stood as a mighty and self-assured civilization. For the U.S. This unequal exchange was both a source of admiration and frustration, a dynamic that would echo throughout history. In many ways, this early struggle foreshadowed the debates we hear even today about trade deficits, economic dependence, and the search for balance between these two nations. As the 19th century unfolded, the imbalance in trade between China and the West grew sharper. The British, frustrated by their own deficits, found a dangerous solution: opium. Large-scale smuggling of opium into China not only created widespread addiction but also destabilized Chinese society. This culminated in the Opium Wars, which forced the Qing dynasty to sign a series of humiliating treaties that opened Chinese ports to foreign powers. The United States, unlike Britain, did not take the lead in the opium trade. American merchants were involved in smaller ways, but overall, the U.S. positioned itself as more neutral. However, neutrality did not mean disinterest. The U.S. quietly reaped benefits when the doors of China were pried open. With the Treaty of Wangjia in 1844, America secured favorable trading rights, joining Britain and other European powers in enjoying access to Chinese markets without firing a single shot. This period marked the beginning of what historians call the unequal treaty system, a web of agreements that left China vulnerable and exposed. For Americans, it was an opportunity to expand trade with fewer restrictions. For the Chinese, it was another chapter in a painful era of foreign intrusion. The irony is clear: while the United States often prided itself on values of fairness and independence, it still took advantage of China's weakened position. American ships filled their holds with tea, silk, and porcelain at reduced tariffs, while China had little choice but to comply. This moment set the stage for a complicated relationship, one where the U.S. could simultaneously claim moral distance from European imperialism while still benefiting from the very same system that undermined China's sovereignty. It was a contradiction that would shape attitudes on both sides for years to come. By the mid-19th century, the U.S.-China relationship took on a new dimension, not just through trade, but through people. Waves of Chinese immigrants began arriving in America, driven by poverty at home and pulled by the promise of opportunity abroad. The California gold rush of 1849 was one of the first magnets. For many Chinese, it was a chance to escape hardship and chase the dream of wealth in the Golden Mountain, as America was often called. Chinese workers soon became an essential part of the American economy. They labored in mines, farms, and especially on the Transcontinental Railroad, one of the most ambitious engineering projects of the 19th century. Without the determination, skill, and endurance of thousands of Chinese laborers, this railroad, which connected the eastern and western coasts of the United States, might never have been completed. Their contribution became a cornerstone of America's industrial expansion. But alongside their hard work came hostility. Many Americans viewed the Chinese as outsiders who could not assimilate. Competition for jobs during economic downturns fueled resentment, and anti-Chinese sentiment spread quickly. Stereotypes painted them as inferior, strange, or even threatening to American values. This growing prejudice turned into violence at times, with attacks on Chinese communities and eventually, into legislation. The resentment culminated in the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882. The first U.S. Law to explicitly ban immigration based on nationality. This act institutionalized racism, legally labeling the Chinese as unfit to be part of American society. For the Chinese who came seeking opportunity, it was a bitter reality. They had helped build America's infrastructure and economy, yet they were met with exclusion and discrimination. This episode highlights both the promise and the deep contradictions of America's relationship with China during this era. The passage of the Chinese Exclusion Act in 1882 was more than just another law. It was a turning point in American history and in the relationship between the United States and China. For the first time, the U.S. government officially banned immigration based on nationality, sending a clear message that Chinese workers, despite their enormous contributions, were no longer welcome. The law came at a time when anti-Chinese sentiment was at its peak. Economic competition, cultural differences, and racial prejudice combined into a toxic narrative. Many American workers accused the Chinese of stealing jobs, working for lower wages, and being unwilling to assimilate. Politicians capitalized on these fears, presenting exclusion as a way to protect American labor and identity. The consequences were immediate and severe. Chinese immigration slowed to a trickle. Families were separated, and entire communities lived under constant fear of harassment. Those who remained in America often faced legal restrictions, social isolation, and violent attacks. For decades, Chinese people were portrayed not as neighbors or co-workers, but as outsiders who could never truly belong. On a larger scale, the Chinese Exclusion Act institutionalized racism within U.S. law. It set a precedent for other restrictive immigration policies that targeted specific groups. In essence, it turned prejudice into policy, embedding discrimination into the legal framework of the nation. For China, the act was a bitter insult. At a time when the country was already weakened by internal strife and foreign pressure, the exclusion policy underscored how little respect it commanded on the world stage. For the United States, it revealed a contradiction. A nation built on ideals of freedom and equality was simultaneously denying those very principles to people who had helped build its infrastructure and economy. As the 19th century turned into the 20th, the U.S.-China relationship began to shift once again. This time, the connection was not only about goods or labor but also about ideas. American missionaries and educators traveled across the Pacific, bringing with them Christianity, Western-style schools, and new philosophies about governance and progress. On the surface, many of these efforts were motivated by genuine ideals spreading faith, literacy, and knowledge. Missionaries established schools, hospitals, and churches in China, often in places where local communities lacked such resources. To some Chinese families, these institutions offered opportunities for education and advancement that were otherwise out of reach. Yet, there was always another layer. These efforts were often carried out with a sense of cultural superiority. Americans frequently saw themselves as civilizing agents, assuming that their religion, values, and systems were inherently better. While some Chinese embraced the chance to learn new skills or languages, others saw these attitudes as condescending or even threatening to their traditions. At the same time, many Chinese reformers and intellectuals began to look outward, searching for models of modernization. For them, the United States represented a dynamic, rapidly developing society that had managed to blend republican governance with economic growth. Figures within China's reform movement studied American institutions, hoping to adapt lessons that might help strengthen their own country during a time of internal weakness and external pressure. This period of exchange highlighted a paradox. On one hand, it created pathways for mutual understanding and the transfer of knowledge. On the other, it reinforced unequal dynamics, with Americans often approaching China with a teacher and pupil mentality. Still, The seeds planted by this cultural and educational exchange would bear fruit in the next generation of Chinese leaders and thinkers. At the dawn of the 20th century, tensions in China erupted in dramatic fashion with the Boxer Rebellion. This violent, anti-foreign uprising was fueled by resentment toward Western intrusion, missionary activity, and the growing influence of foreign powers. The Boxers, as they were called, targeted missionaries, converts, and foreign residents, believing that driving them out would help restore China's sovereignty and dignity. For the United States, the rebellion presented both a challenge and an opportunity. On one hand, American citizens and missionaries were among those attacked, prompting Washington to join an international military coalition that intervened to suppress the movement. This intervention placed the U.S. firmly alongside other Western powers in enforcing their will upon China, reinforcing the perception of unequal power dynamics. Yet, America's response also carried a unique twist. After the rebellion was crushed, China was forced to pay a large indemnity, essentially a fine to the victorious powers. Unlike others, however, the United States chose to return a significant portion of its share. Rather than keeping all the money, the U.S. directed those funds toward creating a scholarship program that allowed Chinese students to study in American universities. This decision had lasting consequences. It provided opportunities for a new generation of Chinese intellectuals, reformers, and future leaders to experience American education firsthand. Many of them returned home with fresh ideas about modernization, governance, and global engagement, helping to shape China's path in the years ahead. The Boxer Rebellion highlighted the deep mistrust between China and foreign powers, but the scholarship fund also showed that even in the midst of conflict, seeds of cultural exchange could be planted. This dual legacy, force on one side, opportunity on the other, would remain a recurring theme in U.S.-China relations. The early 20th century brought monumental changes to China, and with them, new opportunities and challenges for its relationship with the United States. In 1911, the Qing dynasty, which had ruled for centuries, finally collapsed. Out of its ruins emerged the Republic of China, led by reform-minded figures like Sun Yat-sen, who sought to modernize the country and establish a new constitutional order. For the United States, this was a moment of cautious optimism. Washington had long promoted the idea of an open-door policy ensuring equal trading rights for all powers in China without outright colonization. The rise of the Republic seemed to offer hope that China might stabilize and embrace reforms aligned with modern governance, something many American leaders saw as beneficial for both commerce and international order. But the reality was far more complex. The new republic quickly fell into internal strife, with warlords competing for power and fragile governments struggling to maintain control. At the same time, Japan began asserting itself as the dominant power in East Asia. Its rapid industrialization, military victories, and territorial ambitions from Korea to Manchuria overshadowed both China's fragile republic and America's influence in the region. Although the U.S. continued to voice support for China's sovereignty, it often placed its own strategic and economic interests above direct involvement. For many Chinese, America was a distant partner, sympathetic in words but limited in action. For Americans, China's instability made it difficult to imagine a strong alliance. This period underscored the uneven rhythm of U.S.-China relations, moments of shared ideals and possibilities, constantly undercut by domestic turmoil within China and the shifting power dynamics of Asia. By the 1930s, it was increasingly clear that Japan's rise, rather than U.S.-China cooperation, would dominate the region's geopolitics. World War II marked one of the rare moments when the United States and China stood firmly on the same side. After Japan's invasion of China in the 1930s, the two nations found themselves as allies against a common enemy. For Washington, supporting China was part of a larger strategy to contain Japanese expansion in the Pacific. For China, American assistance was a lifeline in a brutal struggle for survival. The U.S. provided military and financial aid, hoping to strengthen China's resistance. American planes, supplies, and advisors made their way across the treacherous hump air route over the Himalayas, while American generals like Joseph Stilwell worked directly with Chinese forces. On paper, this partnership seemed like the foundation of a lasting alliance. But the reality was far less smooth. Corruption plagued the nationalist government led by Chiang Kai-shek. Supplies intended for the battlefield often disappeared into the black market or were diverted to strengthen political power rather than fight Japan. American advisors grew increasingly frustrated, and tensions between Chinese leaders and their U.S. counterparts were constant. At the same time, the differences in priorities were stark. For the United States, China was one theater in a global war. Europe and the Pacific Islands often took precedence. For the Chinese, however, the fight against Japan was existential, a battle that determined the very survival of their nation. Despite the friction, the alliance did achieve significant results. China tied down large numbers of Japanese troops, preventing them from being deployed elsewhere. And American support helped China remain in the fight until Japan's eventual surrender. Yet, as soon as the war ended, the underlying mistrust resurfaced. The wartime partnership had been one of necessity rather than true harmony, a fragile cooperation shaped more by circumstance than by shared vision. The end of World War II did not bring unity between the United States and China. Instead, it ushered in a new era of division. In 1949, the Chinese Civil War ended with the Communist Party, led by Mao Zedong, taking control and founding the People's Republic of China (PRC). The defeated nationalist forces, under Chiang Kai-shek, retreated to Taiwan. For Washington, this was a seismic shock. The world's most populous nation had now aligned itself with communism, joining the Soviet Union in what seemed like a united front against the West. The Korean War quickly made this divide unmistakable. When North Korea, backed by the Soviet Union and later China, invaded the South, U.S. forces intervened under the United Nations flag. Soon, American and Chinese troops found themselves clashing directly on the Korean peninsula. The fighting was intense and costly, with staggering losses on both sides. For many Americans, China was no longer just a distant country, it was an adversary whose soldiers had fought them face to face. During this time, Washington officially recognized only the nationalist government in Taiwan as the legitimate China. The U.S. pledged to defend the island through the U.S. Taiwan Mutual Defense Treaty of 1954, solidifying the Taiwan Strait as a flashpoint that remains sensitive even today. Meanwhile, the PRC leaned heavily toward the Soviet Union in its early years. Ideologically and strategically, the two powers presented themselves as pillars of the communist bloc. To American leaders, this alignment confirmed the fear of a global communist threat, deepening the divide of the Cold War. What followed was a period of profound mistrust. The U.S. viewed China as a hostile partner of Moscow, while Beijing saw Washington as the ultimate obstacle to its sovereignty and security. This hardened standoff defined the 1950s and set the stage for the surprising shifts that would follow in the next decade. By the late 1960s, the rigid lines of the Cold War began to blur, and with them came one of the most unexpected shifts in modern diplomacy, the opening between the United States and China. Ironically, the spark came not from friendship but from rivalry. The once solid alliance between China and the Soviet Union had fractured badly. Border clashes, ideological disputes, and personal tensions between Mao Zedong and Soviet leaders left Beijing deeply suspicious of Moscow. For Washington, this rift presented a strategic opportunity. The U.S. was still entangled in Vietnam, and the global balance of power was dominated by competition with the Soviet Union. Bringing China closer, or at least reducing hostility, could tilt that balance in America's favor. The breakthrough came in 1971. When Henry Kissinger, President Richard Nixon's national security advisor, secretly traveled to Beijing. These talks paved the way for Nixon himself to make a historic visit the following year. When the American president stepped off the plane in Beijing in February 1972, it was more than a diplomatic trip, it was a moment that stunned the world. The meetings between Nixon and Mao, along with Premier Zhou Enlai, signaled a new era of pragmatic cooperation. The two sides did not suddenly become allies. Differences over ideology, Taiwan, and global influence remained sharp. But both nations recognized the benefits of engagement. For China, opening relations with the U.S. offered access to technology, trade, and a counterbalance to Soviet pressure. For America, it was a masterstroke in Cold War strategy, reshaping the geopolitical chessboard into a triangular balance among Washington, Moscow, and Beijing. The Nixon visit marked the beginning of a cautious partnership built on mutual interests rather than trust. It showed that even fierce rivals could find common ground when global realities demanded it, a lesson that continues to echo in U.S.-China relations today. And so, when we look back at the long and complicated history of U.S.-China relations, one theme becomes clear: it has never been simple. From the hopeful voyage of the Empress of China in 1784 to the heated battlefields of Korea, and from exclusion laws to Nixon's historic handshake in 1972, the story has always been a mix of admiration and mistrust, opportunity and rivalry. For the United States, China has often represented both fascination and fear, a source of wealth, culture, and inspiration, but also a competitor that challenges American influence. For China, America has been at times a model of modernization, at other times a source of humiliation, and always a powerful presence in its path toward national revival. What makes this history so important is how much of it still echoes today. Trade imbalances, cultural misunderstandings, immigration debates, and questions about global power are not new. They are threads woven into this relationship from the very beginning. By understanding the origins of these tensions, we can see that today's rivalry is not just about economics or politics, it is the continuation of a centuries-long story. And perhaps, just as in the past, moments of conflict can also create unexpected opportunities for dialogue and cooperation. History does not repeat itself exactly, but it often rhymes. Thank you for joining me on this journey through time. If you enjoyed this exploration of the real reasons behind America's complicated feelings toward China, do not forget to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and share your thoughts in the comments below. What do you think the future holds for these two powerful nations? Until next time, stay curious, stay thoughtful, and I will see you in the next story.